Geoffrey Chaucer, considered by many to be the greatest English poet of the Middle Ages, observed in the Canterbury Tales, "A man may say the truth in game and play." It's where we get our expression, a true word spoken in jest. Now, you'd hardly describe what we've just heard read as jest, would you? And yet, to these soldiers, it is a game. But Chaucer was right. A man may say the truth in game and play. These soldiers think this is just a cruel joke, but without knowing it, they speak the truth about who Jesus is. The governor's soldiers, as Matthew describes them, were non-Jewish soldiers from the regions nearby. There's almost certainly anti-Semitism at play here. The philosopher Philo records other instances of this kind of thing happening. These soldiers get a chance to have some violent fun at the expense of one called the King of the Jews, and the appeal was enough to attract the whole company of soldiers to join in. It's the kind of bullying violence we saw coming out of Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, isn't it? A defenceless victim, those in charge enjoying their power trip. And Matthew records 7 parts to their brutal mockery. They strip Jesus. Humiliation was part of the punishment. And they dress him in a robe. If he's the king, he needs to look the part, they think. So they give him a robe, probably the short cloak the soldiers themselves would wear. The dress-ups continue by putting a crown of thorns on his head, a cruel imitation of the emperor's radiant crown pictured on Roman coins. And then they put a pretend royal staff in his hand. They worship him, kneeling in front of him and mocking him. They spit on him and then they beat him with the staff they've just thrust into his hand. It's brutal, it's sustained, and it comes after Jesus has already been flogged or scourged immediately before this. Roman scourging was a terrible process, often done by 2 soldiers, one on each side, wielding a leather whip with lead and bone embedded in the ends. Scourging could cut so deep into the flesh that the internal organs would be exposed, and prisoners would sometimes die from it before they even got to whatever was supposed to come next. In the previous chapter, Jesus had been mocked and beaten by the Jewish religious leaders. Now it comes from Gentiles, non-Jews. We're supposed to see the universal rejection. But we're also supposed to see Jesus' own words being fulfilled in this. Back in chapter 20, he'd spoken of being handed over to the religious leaders, who would condemn him to death, and then in turn hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the 3rd day he will be raised to life, Jesus said. This is precisely the route that Jesus has committed to, because he knows that he's the servant spoken of in Isaiah 53, those other words we heard read earlier. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Jesus knew this was coming. In fact, Jesus drove these events to their completion. What on earth could possibly convince someone to not just endure this, but to deliberately choose this path? Well, what did Isaiah say all those centuries before? The punishment that brought us peace was on him. Isaiah is talking about the fact that each one of us is separate from God and not just neutral towards God. We're in active rejection of him. Of course, it doesn't normally look like the rejection of Jesus at the hands of these soldiers, does it? We do it in a much nicer, more polite way. We put other things, ourselves, our desires, our family, in the place of God. We take all the good things he gives us, but we want nothing to do with God. It's what the Bible calls sin. And there's a penalty for sin. We deserve to be separated from God and his blessings forever. But what was God's promise through Isaiah? This servant of God would take up our pain, he'd bear our suffering, and through his punishment, this mockery and violence here and the much, much worse which is about to follow, we would find peace. Jesus steps into our place so we can have peace with the God who we've rejected. As we saw though, the way these soldiers express their rejection of Jesus contains an element of truth, doesn't it? He is a king. He is God come in human flesh. He is worthy of worship. If only they'd done these things without the mocking. If only they'd seen in him their creator God come to bring peace. Lots of people today still reject Jesus, want nothing to do with him. Usually very polite, hardly ever looks like this. Maybe that's you today. You've just never seen that Jesus is worth your time or attention. But will you consider what Jesus goes through to flip that rejection on its head? He takes it on himself willingly, enduring rejection and false worship to bring us peace with the God we've ignored. A man may say the truth in game and play. Chaucer was right. These soldiers spoke and acted more truthfully than they realised. Here is their king. Here is their God. Roman crucifixion was as much public relations messaging as it was punishment. It was how an oppressive regime warned its people, see what happens to those who break the rules. Usually the condemned person was forced to carry the crossbeam on which they were to be crucified out to the city, to the spot where the crucifixion would take place. In this case, it seems that Jesus is so weakened by the events of the past 12 hours or so that a man named Simon is pressed into service. He's the one who carries Jesus' cross to the place called Golgotha, which, as Matthew says, means the place of the skull. The crucifixion itself is recorded so very simply, literally just, they crucified him. Only 2 words in Matthew's original language. See, Matthew wants us to look around and take in what everyone else is doing, the detail of how things are unfolding. The soldiers are still there, of course, and their mockery and humiliation of Jesus continues as they offer him wine to drink mixed with gall. Instead of some relief, Jesus finds only torment at the hands of those crucifying him. And even his clothes, seemingly the only things he possessed in the world, are divided up among them. Then there's the 2 rebels crucified with Jesus. The Romans reserved crucifixion for only the very worst criminals. Commonly, these 2 are referred to as thieves. Perhaps today we'd call them terrorists. But notice down in verse 44, even these criminals turn on Jesus and heaped insults on him. There's the passers-by who also hurled insults at him, shaking their heads. The religious leaders join in too. The chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders mocked him. Now, they don't know they're doing this, but each one of these groups showed Jesus to be God's promised king who rescues his people. For centuries, God had been promising a king, the Messiah, who would suffer, but even though he'd suffer, he'd be victorious and he'd open the way for people to come to God. So places like Psalm 22 in the Old Testament, written 1,000 years before Jesus, speak of this king, his suffering and his victory. We find words like this: a pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. Or in Psalm 69, we read, they put gall in my food and gave me vinegar for my thirst. Now, if the psalm described a crucifixion and the details of Jesus' crucifixion just happened to line up, you'd have to say it's a remarkable coincidence. But crucifixion wasn't invented for another 500 years after King David. Now, he's speaking about an event in the future when God's king suffers at the hands of evil men. So when the soldiers do this to Jesus, they prove to us Jesus is the promised king. Or consider the rebels who heaped insults on Jesus. We learn exactly what that sounded like on the lips of those who passed by. Verse 40. You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God. And similarly, the religious leaders, verse 43. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, I am the Son of God. Now come back to Psalm 22 again. And what King David says, this other king will endure. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. By fulfilling the psalm, the rebels, the crowds, the religious leaders show us that Jesus is God's promised king, the Messiah. And the climax of Psalm 22 promises that because of the salvation won through this suffering, all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. There's nowhere in David's own life where that happened. And so we see the psalm was always intended to speak of Jesus and the kind of death he would die, and how he would open up the way for people to come to God. The dreadful irony of those earlier verses in Matthew 27 is that Jesus really is a king. Now all of those gathered at the cross show us Jesus is the King, the Messiah whose death opens the way for people to come to God. Perhaps more than any other time in our memory, we want to know now that things are under control, don't we? And seeing what's happened to our government and our Prime Minister this week, we're reminded that there are lots of things beyond our control. Whether we get sick, whether we die of this illness, whether we get furloughed or lose our job, we might be tempted to think Jesus' death suggests everything's out of control. But this historical evidence tells us Jesus is God's eternal King, the one who holds everything in his hands. All the nations will bow down before him, as the psalm promises. Even the details of who said and did what around Jesus' cross come to pass exactly as God had promised. Isn't this what we need in a moment of crisis? Someone in control of even the smallest details? Is that your picture of Jesus? If God's care of and involvement in his world extends to the level of words and actions worked out in this event, then we have every reason for confidence in God's care of his world today. And Psalm 22 teaches us what Jesus knew, that the way for us to come to God is only open because he chooses this path of suffering. Being Australian, people often compare me to that great Australian philosopher, Mick Crocodile Dundee. Pretty sure the only point of similarity is our nationality. But beside wrestling crocs and waving knives around, Mick Dundee is known for saying, Jesus and all of those disciples were fishermen like me. So me and God, we'd be mates. It's an appealing sentiment, isn't it? That we could be mates with God. That on our own, God will be pretty happy with us. Problem is, this problem of sin. Our rejection of God means that can't possibly be true. The penalty for sin is death and separation from God. See how that plays out in this section? Look with me from verse 45. From noon until 3 p.m, darkness came over all the land. In the Bible, light often symbolises God's presence and blessing, and darkness is a sign of God's anger and judgment. So as Jesus dies and darkness covers the land, we know that God is angry. His judgment is at hand. Sin, that rebellion against God that expresses itself in hatred and selfishness and unkindness and all manner of evil, is being punished. Over the years, some people have tried to soften God a bit, tried to make him more appealing by telling us that God doesn't really get angry or doesn't really punish people. And on the surface, this can sound like a great idea. But we don't actually want that, do we? I realise it sounds like the height of arrogance for me to tell you what kind of God you want. But I don't think any of us want a God who doesn't get angry at sin and evil. We get angry when we see people spitting on frontline workers to give them the coronavirus. We're offended at the selfishness of shoppers who clear shelves of food and even toilet paper with no thought for the needs of others. You and I believe there must be justice for those who suffer. God does too. A God who gets angry at sin and demands justice is very, very good news. That is the kind of God that we want. When darkness came over all the land, we're assured that God is a God who gets angry at sin, that evil is being punished, the due penalty for sin is paid. But Jesus didn't have any sin of his own to pay for. Remember those words from Isaiah the prophet. He was pierced for our transgressions. This is our sin being paid for. And it explains Jesus' words spoken in Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? We're often captured by the physical agony of the cross. I remember watching that film, The Passion of the Christ, and being almost speechless afterwards as I tried to process the brutality it captured. But Matthew's focus is more on the spiritual agony of the crucifixion. Though clearly Jesus can't be looking for an actual answer to the question, why is this happening to me? He knows why. He'd predicted his death. He'd promised his resurrection. But those words, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the opening line of Psalm 22. Jesus cries out the first line, so we reflect on the trajectory of the psalm. God's great rescue through the suffering of his chosen king is at hand. But let's not gloss over the cry of abandonment too quickly. The prophet Habakkuk says of God, "Your eyes are too pure to look on evil." And so as Jesus takes our sin on himself, the perfect relationship between Jesus and his Father is broken. Jesus didn't stop being God or anything like that. But as we sometimes sing, the Father turns his face away as Jesus willingly steps into our place, saying, "I'll take the penalty for sin so they don't have to." There is a real separation, the terrible consequence of sin. And so as Jesus dies, cut off from his Father, verse 51, the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, the bit that captures our attention is about those dead people being raised to life. We're not given much detail about that. People coming back to life is a strange thing to happen. But that's the point. Since sin leads to death and separation from God, when the price for sin is paid, death is defeated. This is just a taste. Those people will die again. But it reminds us also that Jesus' death is sufficient for all people, even those who had lived and died before him. But that other event shows our separation from God because of our sin is undone. In the temple of God in Jerusalem was an enormous curtain that separated people from the central room called the Holy of Holies, where God's presence dwelt in a unique way. It was enormous, 9 meters high, as thick as 2 volumes of a decent dictionary. The curtain had one purpose. It was a great big 9-meter high "Do Not Enter" sign. It was a reminder that it's impossible for sinful people like you and I to walk into the presence of God. Sin means separation. We are not mates with God. But as Jesus dies, God tears the curtain, the symbol of separation, from top to bottom. If we trust in Jesus' death, if we believe that that was what we deserved, we can now be welcomed by God. If you wanted, you could even put it in Mick Dundee's words, we can be mates with God. But this has cost Jesus his life. It looks like he's been defeated. There's an amusing story about a British admiral named Robert Calder informing London that the Duke of Wellington had defeated the French forces in Spain. The message was started with flag telegraphy. Wellington defeated, but then a fog rapidly descended and the rest of the message was lost. The story goes that British Parliament was in utter despair until much later in the day when the fog lifted and the rest of the message could be transmitted. Wellington defeated the French. Good Friday. Jesus, our King, defeated sin and death.